She said it because she was suffocating. Suffocating under the weight of her mother's debts. Suffocating in the soft pink lace of a gown that felt more like a burial shroud. Suffocating from the way the elderly Lord Vane watched her from across the room, as if she were a piece of meat at an auction. "I will say yes to the very first man who asks me tonight," Clara whispered, her voice sharp, reckless, and loud enough to cut through the orchestral music. Her mother, Lady Evangeline, gasped, her hand flying to her throat in horror. A few debutantes giggled behind their fans. A scandalized murmur rippled through the nearest circle of aristocrats. No one believed she would actually forfeit her future on a whim of spite. Not really. Then the heavy oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open with a thud that silenced the violins. The laughter died instantly, like a flame doused in ice. A man stepped into the light, his black tailcoat cutting a severe midnight silhouette against the gold leaf of the hall. He did not offer a polite bow. He did not scan the room for an acquaintance. He looked directly at her with eyes as cold as a winter morning. Clara felt the air leave her lungs as the room grew unervingly still. The Duke of Thornfield, the man they called the Winter King, had arrived to claim her word. The Ashbourne ballroom was a kaleidoscope of shimmering silk and artificial smiles. Hundreds of candles flickered in crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, deceptive glow over a room full of people waiting for her to fail. The scent of heavy lilies and expensive perfume hung thick in the air, sweet enough to be sickly. But Clara felt none of the heat. She stood near the balcony edge, her white opera gloves trembling slightly as she gripped the stone railing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the sudden, heavy silence of the guests. The man walking toward her was a legend of stone and shadow. Everyone knew the stories of Lucien Windermere, a duke who ruled his vast northern estates with a frozen heart. A man who appeared at social functions only to remind the world that he was untouchable. And now, he was crossing the polished marble floor with slow, predatory steps. He didn't look like a suitor. He looked like a hunter who had just seen his prey walk into a trap of her own making. As he stopped inches from her, the Coldest Duke didn't ask for a dance. He simply reached out and took her hand. The silence that followed the Duke of Thornfield's entrance was not merely a lack of sound. It was a physical weight, pressing the breath from the lungs of every debutante and dandy in the room. Clara felt the heat of 100 stares prickling her skin, but her own gaze was locked onto the man moving toward her. Lucien Windermere did not walk so much as he reclaimed the space he occupied. Each step was measured, his polished boots clicking against the marble with the finality of a gavel. Her mother's fingers dug into Clara's forearm, a desperate, bruising grip. "Clara, be silent," Lady Evangeline hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and predatory hope. "Do not breathe another word." But the Duke was already there. He stopped exactly 3 paces away, tall enough to block out the light of the central chandelier. Up close, he was even more formidable, a landscape of sharp angles and midnight wool. His cravat was tied with a precision that bordered on clinical, and his face, though devastatingly handsome, held the animation of a winter sky before a storm. "Miss Ashbourne," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. He didn't look at her mother. He didn't acknowledge the gasping crowd. "I believe I heard a declaration." Clara's heart thudded, a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs. The bravado that had fueled her reckless vow was evaporating, replaced by a cold realization of what she had summoned. Yet, as she looked past the Duke's shoulder, she saw Lord Vane stepping forward, a smug, possessive sneer twisting his aged features. Vane believed he had already won her. He believed her family's debt made her his property. The sight of him sparked a final, defiant ember in her soul. She straightened her spine, her chin lifting until she was looking the Duke directly in his icy gray eyes. "You did, Your Grace," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I said I would marry the first man to ask. I am a woman of my word." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Lady Evangeline's hand dropped from Clara's arm as if she had been burned. Lucien Windermere's expression did not soften, but something shifted in the depths of his gaze, a flicker of dark curiosity. He reached out, his hand encased in a black leather glove, and waited. It was a silent command, an invitation to a precipice. "Then I shall not let such a generous offer go to waste," the Duke said, his tone devoid of warmth but heavy with a strange, sudden protection. He took her hand, his grip firm and startlingly possessive. As he led her toward the center of the dance floor, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Clara realized then that she hadn't just ruined her mother's plans, she had stepped out of a small cage and into a kingdom of ice. But as the Duke's hand pressed against the small of her back, she felt, for the first time in years, that Lord Vane could no longer reach her. The carriage ride to Thornfield's town residence was conducted in a silence so crystalline it felt as though the slightest word might shatter it. Clara sat stiffly against the velvet upholstery, the phantom pressure of the Duke's hand still lingering on her waist. Across from her, Lucian Windermere remained a statue of shadow and bone, his gaze fixed on the passing gaslights of London. He did not look like a man who had just saved a lady. He looked like a man who had just acquired a difficult piece of territory. When they arrived, he did not lead her to a drawing-room for tea. He led her to his study, a room that smelled of old parchment, cedarwood, and the cold snap of an approaching winter. He didn't offer her a chair. Instead, he walked behind a massive mahogany desk and placed a single sheet of heavy cream paper between them. "My mother's debts," Clara began, her voice small in the cavernous room. "Lord Vane holds the notes. He intended to—" "I know what he intended," Lucian interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He didn't look up as he unscrewed the cap of a silver inkwell. "The debts are settled. I purchased the notes from Vane before I entered the ballroom. You are no longer beholden to him, nor to your mother's profligacy." Clara felt a dizzying rush of relief, followed immediately by a sharp, cold fear. "Then I am beholden to you." "Precisely." He finally looked up, his grey eyes searching hers with a clinical intensity. "You made a public vow, Miss Ashbourne. You said, yes, to the first man who asked. I have merely held you to your own standard of honor. But let us be clear about the nature of this union. I do not seek a wife for companionship, nor do I require the flutterings of a romantic heart." He pushed the paper toward her. It was a contract, written in a precise, angular hand. "You will be the Duchess of Thornfield," he continued, his tone devoid of warmth. "You will oversee my household and appear at my side when the crown requires it. In exchange, you will have total financial independence, the protection of my name, and the assurance that your mother will never bother you again. But there is one condition. You are never to enter the east wing of my estate, and you are never to ask about the woman who occupied it before you." Clara looked at the ink, still wet on the page. It was a golden cage, far grander than the one her mother had built, but a cage nonetheless. She thought of Lord Vane's greasy touch and her mother's desperate greed. Then she looked at the Duke, a man who offered her a fortress of ice in exchange for her freedom. She picked up the quill. Her hand trembled for a fleeting second before she stilled it. With a sharp, decisive motion, she signed her name. "A contract signed in ice," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "The only kind that doesn't melt when things get hot, Miss Ashbourne," he replied, and for the first time she saw a shadow of something human and deeply wounded flicker in his eyes. The rumors arrived at Thornfield House before the morning tea was even poured. By noon, the heavy velvet curtains of Mayfair were twitching with the scandal of the mercenary Miss and the Winter King. Clara sat in the morning-room, the soft pink lace of her gown, the same one she had worn to the ball, feeling like an ironic reminder of her former life. She was no longer the invisible daughter of a gambling widow. She was the most talked-about woman in London. But the safety she had bought with her signature felt increasingly fragile as the carriage of her aunt, the formidable Countess of Stirling, pulled up to the curb. "You have no idea what you've done, Clara," her aunt declared, sweeping into the room without an invitation. She didn't offer a hug, she offered a warning. "Lucian Windermere is not a man. He is a glacier. Do you know why he disappeared for 3 years? Do you know what happened to the last woman who wore that name?" Clara's fingers tightened around the handle of her teacup. "He settled my mother's debts, aunt. He saved me from Lord Vane." "He bought you, Clara." "There is a difference," the Countess hissed, leaning in close. "The Ton calls him the Coldest Duke for a reason. They say his heart died with his first wife, and that he keeps her shadow locked in the east wing of that house. People who cross him don't just lose their reputations, they vanish. You've traded a common wolf for a legendary monster. The warning echoed in Clara's mind long after her aunt departed. As evening fell, the house grew unervingly quiet. The servants moved like ghosts, their eyes averted, their voices hushed. The grandeur of the estate began to feel oppressive, the high ceilings swallowing the sound of her footsteps. Restless, Clara found herself wandering toward the grand staircase. She looked up at the darkened gallery where portraits of past duchesses stared down with hollow eyes. Her thoughts drifted to the contract, the East Wing, the forbidden territory. Suddenly, a shadow lengthened across the floor. Lucien stood at the end of the hall, still dressed in his severe black silks. He watched her with an intensity that made her pulse leap, not with fear, but with a strange magnetic pull. "Your family has been busy today," he said, his voice a low rumble in the twilight. "They tell you I am a monster." "They say you are cold," Clara replied, her voice braver than she felt, "and that you have secrets behind locked doors." Lucien took a step closer, the scent of cedar and cold air enveloping her. "Every house has secrets, Clara. But in this house, the secrets keep you safe from the world outside. Remember that when the whispers get too loud." He turned to leave, but for a split second, the moonlight caught his face, revealing a flash of agonizing loneliness that no contract could hide. Clara realized then that the shadows of Thornfield weren't just in the hallways. They were living inside the man she had just promised to marry. Lucien's invitation arrived not as a request, but as a summons. The note, hand-delivered by a footman whose face remained a mask of polite indifference, simply stated, "The conservatory. 4:00. Clara arrived early, her heart performing a nervous dance against her ribs. The conservatory was a glass cathedral of exotic ferns and frozen silver light. In the center, a small table was set with bone china so thin it looked like eggshells. Lucien was already there, but he wasn't sitting. He was tending to a wilting white rose, his large, gloved hands moving with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the man who had terrified the ton. "They say you have no heart, Your Grace," Clara said, stepping into the humid warmth of the glass room. "Yet you spend your time nursing flowers." Lucien didn't turn around immediately. He carefully snipped a dead leaf away before facing her. The harsh sunlight of the afternoon caught the silver at his temples, making him look older and more tired than he had in the ballroom. "A garden is a logical pursuit, Miss Ashbourne. It requires order. It rewards care. Unlike the world out there, it does not lie." "Is that what you think I am doing? Lying?" He pulled out a chair for her, his movements stiffly formal. "I think you are a young woman who was backed into a corner by a mother who treats her daughter like a hand of cards. I think you are brave enough to be reckless, which is a dangerous combination." As he poured the tea, Clara watched his hands. They were steady, sure, and devoid of the tremor she felt in her own. But as he handed her the cup, his sleeve shifted, revealing a glimpse of a faint, jagged scar running up his wrist and disappearing under his cuff. "Why me, Lucien?" she asked, using his name for the first time. The word felt heavy and forbidden on her tongue. "There are 100 women who would have gladly taken your name without the dramatics of a public vow. Why step forward for a woman who was trying to ruin herself?" Lucien sat down, his gray eyes fixing on hers with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant drip of water against a glass pane. "Because," he said softly, "I recognized the look in your eyes. It is the look of someone who is tired of being the only person fighting for their life. I didn't step forward to catch a bride, Clara. I stepped forward to stop the execution." For the first time since the mall, since the night of the ball, the coldness in the room seemed to thaw. He wasn't a monster. He was a sentinel. But as he reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers, the shadow of the East Wing seemed to loom over them. "Eat your toast, Clara," he said, the ice returning to his voice as quickly as it had vanished. "Tomorrow, the real work begins. We have a life to fake." The morning after the conservatory, the fragile peace of Thornfield House was shattered by the arrival of Lady Evangeline. She did not wait for the butler to announce her. She burst into the morning room like a gale, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards. Clara, who had been attempting to read, felt the familiar, cold knot of dread tighten in her chest. "You selfish, wretched girl!" Evangeline cried, Her face flushed beneath her feathered hat. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You have insulted a man of Lord Vane's standing for a whim. A public spectacle." Clara stood slowly, her white opera gloves resting on the mahogany table. "The Duke settled your debts, Mother. You are free. Is that not what you wanted?" "I wanted security," Evangeline shrieked, stepping into Clara's personal space. Vane was predictable. He was grateful. "This Duke, he is a tomb. He has already cut off my allowance. He sent a solicitor to my home this morning with a pittance and a warning to stay away from the estate. He thinks he can separate us." Clara felt a flicker of the Duke's icy resolve rising within her. "He is my fiancé. He is protecting our interests." "Our interests?" Evangeline's laugh was a jagged, ugly sound. She leaned in, her eyes narrowing with a venom that made Clara flinch. "He isn't protecting you, Clara. He is hiding you. And since you've seen fit to ruin my arrangements, I've decided to make some of my own. I went to the papers this morning. I told them the truth, that your vow was a staged play to entrap a grieving widower. I told them you've been chasing Thornfield since the spring." The blood drained from Clara's face. In the eyes of the ton, entrapment was a social death sentence. Her reputation, and by extension the Duke's honor, was being set ablaze. "You would destroy me," Clara whispered. "Your own daughter." "I would remind you who you belong to," Evangeline hissed. "If I cannot have the Wintermere fortune, I will ensure no one wants the Ashbourne name." The door to the study creaked open. Lucien stood there, his presence turning the room into an icebox. He had heard everything. His gaze didn't fall on Clara. It stayed fixed on Lady Evangeline with a lethal, quiet intensity. "Leave," Lucien said. The word was not a shout. It was an execution. "You can't ignore the scandal I've started, Your Grace," Evangeline taunted, though she stepped back. "I do not ignore scandals, Lady Evangeline. I bury them, along with the people who create them." He stepped toward Clara, his hand finding the small of her back. "Your carriage is waiting. It will take you to the countryside. You will stay there, at my expense, and you will never speak to my wife again. If you do, I will ensure the debt collectors find you before the sun sets." As her mother was ushered out, trembling and defeated, Clara turned to Lucien. The betrayal stung like an open wound, but the weight of his hand was a steady, grounding force. The war had begun, and her own mother had fired the first shot. The house fell into a heavy, suffocating stillness after Lady Evangeline's departure. It was the kind of silence that invited ghosts to speak. Clara found herself drawn once more to the grand gallery, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runners. The moon hung low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the portraits of the Wintermere lineage. She stopped before a canvas that was partially shrouded in a velvet cloth, tucked away in a recessed alcove. It was the only one without a nameplate. With a trembling hand, Clara reached out and pulled the fabric aside. The woman in the portrait was ethereal, draped in silks the color of a summer dawn, with a smile that seemed to hold the very warmth Lucien now lacked. Beside her sat a small boy with the Duke's dark hair and a mischievous glint in his eyes. They looked like a family made of light. Her name was Elena, and the boy was Thomas. Clara jumped, the velvet slipping from her fingers as Lucien emerged from the shadows. He didn't look angry, he looked hollowed out, as if the memory were a physical weight crushing his lungs. He didn't approach the painting, staying instead in the darkness where the moonlight couldn't reach him. 6 years ago, he said, his voice a ghost of the command he had used against her mother. A carriage accident on the northern cliffs. The axle snapped in the frost. I was a day behind them, delayed by a meeting of the lords. He finally stepped forward, the silver light catching the moisture in his eyes. I arrived to find the wreckage at the bottom of the ravine. I spent 3 days digging through the ice with my bare hands just to find them. Clara looked at his hands, the hands that had precisely tended the roses and firmly gripped her own. She saw the scars again, not just on his skin, but in the way he held himself, braced against a wind that never stopped blowing. "That is why you are the coldest Duke," she whispered, her heart breaking for the man behind the myth. "You aren't made of stone. You're made of grief. I am made of the resolve that no one under my protection will ever be lost to the cold again, Lucian replied, his gaze finally meeting hers. "When I saw you in that ballroom, Clara, throwing your life away to escape a different kind of wreckage, I couldn't stand by. I cannot bring them back. But I can ensure the world never breaks you." He reached out, his gloved thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. In that moment, the East Wing was no longer a place of malice or secrets. It was a shrine to a love that had been frozen in time. Clara realized then that she wasn't just marrying a title or a protector. She was marrying a man who had survived the end of his world and was trying, in his own silent, frozen way, to build a new one for her. The piece of Thornfield was a fragile glass ornament, and Lord Vane was determined to shatter it. It happened during the midsummer gala, a night when the gardens were transformed into a labyrinth of lanterns and silver silk. Clara had begun to feel the weight of her new title as a shield rather than a burden, but as she stepped away from the music to catch her breath by the koi pond, the shadows shifted. "A duchess in pink lace," a voice rasped, dripping with the oily charm of a serpent. "But we both know the stains beneath the fabric, don't we, Miss Ashbourne?" Clara froze. Lord Vane stepped from behind a weeping willow, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. He no longer looked like a nobleman. He looked like a man who had lost everything at the tables and blamed the cards. In his hand, he clutched a crumpled piece of parchment, the original debt notes her mother had signed in blood and desperation. "The Duke paid your mother silver, but he didn't account for the interest of my pride," Vane hissed, closing the distance until the scent of stale brandy overwhelmed the jasmine. "I have the ledger of your mother's true sins. Crimes that would see her at the gallows, and you stripped of your borrowed crown. I want £10,000 by dawn, or I will hand these to the magistrate." Clara's heart thundered, but she did not flinch. "The Duke has already warned you, my lord. You have no power here." "The Duke is a man of laws," Vane countered, his hand trembling as he reached out to grasp her chin. "But a debt in blood is never truly settled. If you don't pay, I'll take my interest from your pretty throat." He didn't see the shadow behind him until it was too late. Lucian appeared like a vengeful god, his hand catching Vane's wrist with a sickening crack. The Duke didn't shout. His silence was infinitely more terrifying. He twisted Vane's arm behind his back, forcing the older man to his knees in the damp grass. "I told you once that I bury the people who threaten what is mine," Lucian said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He took the parchment from Vane's nerveless fingers and held it over a nearby lantern. The paper curled and blackened, the secrets of the Ashbourne family turning to ash in the night air. "The debt is settled, Vane. If I see your face again, I won't call the magistrate. I will call the undertaker." Vane scrambled away into the darkness, a broken man retreating into the woods. Lucian turned to Clara, his chest heaving with a rare, raw emotion. He reached out, his gloved fingers brushing the spot where Vane had almost touched her. For the first time, the Coldest Duke looked frightened, not of the scandal, but of the thought of losing the woman who had dared to walk into his winter. The echoes of Lord Vane's threats had barely faded before a more formal shadow fell over Thornfield. A gilded invitation, embossed with the royal seal, arrived at the manor. It was not a request for a social appearance. It was a summons to the Queen's private drawing-room. Lady Evangeline's venomous lies to the press had reached the highest ears in the land, and the staged entrapment of a peer of the realm was now a matter of state interest. Clara stood before the tall pier mirror in her dressing-room, her fingers tracing the delicate lace of her sleeves. She wore a gown of deepest midnight blue, a color that mirrored the Duke's constant palette. Beside her, Lucian stood like a sentinel, his reflection stern and unyielding. "They will look for a crack in the ice, Clara," he said, his voice low and steady. "The Queen does not care for romantic whims. She cares for the dignity of the crown. If she believes you played me for a fool, our contract, and your safety, will be voided by morning." "I am not playing, Lucian," Clara whispered, meeting his eyes in the glass. "That is the part my mother didn't understand. Spite brought me to the ballroom, but truth kept me in this house." The audience at St. James's Palace was conducted in a room that felt as cold as a mausoleum. Queen Charlotte sat enthroned in a high-backed chair, her gaze sharp enough to pin a butterfly to a board. Around her, the most influential whispers of the ton waited like vultures for a carcass. "A public vow, Miss Ashbourne?" the Queen asked, her voice dry as parchment. It sounds like the desperate gambit of a social climber. Tell me, why should I not annul this farce and send you back to the obscurity from which you emerged? The room went still. Clara felt the weight of the Duke's presence behind her, a silent fortress. She took a breath, not of the perfumed air of the palace, but of the strength she had gathered at Thornfield. "It was a cry for help, your Majesty," Clara said, her voice ringing clearly through the chamber. "I chose the first man who entered because I was drowning, and I trusted that a gentleman of honor would see my distress. The Duke did not fall for a trap. He chose to stand between me and a life of ruin. If that is a farce, then honor itself is a jest." Lucien stepped forward then, dropping to one knee beside her, not in a performance for the crowd, but in a deliberate alignment of their souls. "She is my Duchess, madam," he said, his voice a resonant thunder. "And anyone who questions her virtue questions my own." The Queen's gaze lingered on them for a long, agonizing minute. Then, the corner of her mouth twitched. "It seems the Winter King has finally found a fire he cannot extinguish. You are dismissed." As they walked out of the palace, the vultures dispersed. The trial of reputation was over, but as Clara looked at Lucien, she realized the greatest transformation was yet to come. They were no longer two people bound by a contract of ice. They were a storm that had learned to protect its own. The carriage ride back from the palace was unlike any other they had shared. The heavy, suffocating silence of their first night had been replaced by a quiet hum of shared victory. London blurred past the windows, a city that had tried to tear them down and failed. As the carriage pulled into the moonlit drive of Thornfield, Lucien did not immediately move to disembark. He sat in the shadows, his gaze fixed on Clara with a look that was no longer clinical or detached. He led her not to the study or the conservatory, but to the small, private terrace overlooking the North Moors. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and the wild, untamed freedom of the country. A single upholstered chair had been placed there, and for the first time, the house felt like a home rather than a fortress. Clara sat, her midnight silk skirts pooling around her like a dark sea. Her heart, which had survived the Queen and her mother's fury, now beat with a different kind of trepidation. Lucien stood before her, the stark light of the moon carving his profile in silver. "Our contract is fulfilled, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rasp. "The Queen has sanctioned our union. Your mother is gone. Vane is a shadow. You are free to walk away with the settlement I promised. You have won your independence." Clara looked up at him, her eyes searching for him. "And what of the Duke of Thornfield? What does he win if I leave?" Lucien's composure wavered. He sank slowly to one knee before her, a mirror of the moment he had claimed her in the ballroom, but this time there was no audience to witness his surrender. He took her gloved hand in his grip steady but incredibly gentle. "He wins a return to the ice," Lucien whispered. "He wins a house of ghosts and a heart that has forgotten how to beat." He reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a simple, elegant ring, a band of gold set with a single brilliant diamond that caught the moonlight. "I am not asking you to stay because of a vow made in spite. I am asking you to stay because you are the only light that has dared to shine in this frozen place." He did not place the ring on her finger immediately. He waited, giving her the choice he had promised from the start. Clara looked at the man who had stood between her and every monster in her life. She realized then that she didn't want the freedom of a lonely world. She wanted the sanctuary of his arms. "I said I would marry the first man who asked," she said, a soft smile finally breaking through her composure as she leaned forward to touch his cheek. "But I am staying for the only man who truly saw me." As Lucien slid the ring onto her finger, the Coldest Duke finally pulled her into a kiss that tasted of salt, moonlight, and the end of a long, bitter winter. The contract was gone, replaced by a reality far more enduring. They were no longer survivors of the past, but architects of a shared, golden future.